The lifeless body of a humble contractor is left for dead at a local fire station.
There's stab wounds on both his chest and in his back.
This truck is covered in blood.
To solve the case, investigators must trace the crime back to its point of origin.
What's that look like to you?
But first, a code of silence needs to be broken.
You're lying through your teeth.
Get the hell out of my house!
The situation did get rather crazy very quick.
Just the smallest little thing can set people off into a horrible rage.
The first thing you learn as a police detective is people do not respond out of a sense of duty. They don't respond to doing the right thing. They don't respond out of a sense of loyalty. They respond to pressure. Self-preservation is what works.
There's one thing that never changes: murder. A life has been taken. Their stories are now.
After a shift change at Fire Station 6, Captain Jerry Binder
Listen, Chapman, you can't go out there without your gear. I don't want to see that happening again. You got me?
Got you, Captain.
Okay, good.
Captain Binder was the captain of this station, and he was a strong leader, had high expectations for his crew members.
Keep that helmet strapped.
Somebody help! Help!
What's wrong,
please? There's a man who's hurt real bad.
Where?
He's outside in the truck.
Ricky, get trauma kit. Meet me outside.
When an emergency responds to the front door of your station, it's an instant go-to-work mode.
So he goes running outside and he finds a shirtless man in the front seat covered in blood.
Hang in there, buddy. We got you.
Come on now. Come on.
Give him the cap. There you go. There you go. There you go.
Oh, damn it. Let's put pressure on that.
As they lay him down, we see there's stab wounds on both his chest and in his back. We begin direct pressure on those injuries, make sure his airway is clear, stop the bleeding.
Jackie, come here, take over from her, will ya?
Code 3, we need help down here.
Binder completes the transmission.
What the hell? Hey, lady!
He looks up and sees that the woman is now walking south, away from the scene.
Where you going?
She's walking away very quickly, like she doesn't want to have anything to do with what's going on.
So what ended up happening with that call over on Fairmount?
I had nothing. Just an old woman couldn't get the garage door open.
On this particular evening, May 29th of 1984, I was still a patrol sergeant working the evening shift.
Did you help her figure it out?
Yeah, come to find out she's at the wrong house.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
Go 4 Paul 1.
Code 3 in progress at Fire Station 6. All units requested.
10-4, 4 Paul 1 en route. Let's move.
Generally, a patrol sergeant's job is to supervise officers on the street. But if a call of a serious nature came in, I would always respond.
You all right, Jerry? So any idea what happened here?
Covered in stab wounds. Doesn't look good.
You know we're gonna have to cordon off the area.
Hey, do what you gotta do.
If you are responding to a violent crime scene, your first determination is to determine the basic facts.
Want to set up a perimeter?
Yes, sir.
Once those facts are known, I was the deciding factor as to what specialists were required.
4 Paul 1 to dispatch.
There's not much the patrol can do with this, so he called for detectives from the homicide unit to respond.
Not 30 minutes later, Detective John Anderson arrives on scene.
John, Gary?
Evening, Joe.
When this first happened, I was the lead detective on this case.
Anderson, a very good detective, well-trained, well-experienced.
So what are we looking at?
Well, the victim showed up in the truck out back. Severe stab wounds to both his back and his chest. We just got notification he was DOA at the hospital.
We got an ID?
He had a wallet on him.
He is, according to the license, James Seaman, 42 years of age. They take that name and they check the registration on the license plate on this truck, and it's his truck.
So he drove himself here? We're not so sure about that. The firefighter said a woman told him about the victim, but she disappeared while they were giving life support.
Did she give a name?
Dark hair, wearing a red jacket.
Can we get a canvass of the area started?
My guys are already on it.
What's important now is to find this woman. Is she responsible for this attack, or is she a good Samaritan?
Let's take a look inside the truck yet?
Not yet.
All right, let's do it.
To our knowledge at this juncture, the only crime scene we have as a possibility is the truck in which he arrived in this fire station.
Guy must have been losing blood pretty fast.
There is a lot of blood in this truck.
There was blood caked on the front seat. There was blood on the steering wheel.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot. Looks like transfer blood to me.
Yeah, there's no cast off on the dash or anything either. He probably wasn't stabbed in the truck then.
Oh, you're probably right.
So now we don't believe the crime scene is in the vehicle. We have to look elsewhere.
So what do you got there? Drywall.
Business cards bearing his name are found in the cab of the vehicle, and the business card says that he is a drywall subcontractor.
Hey, sir.
Any luck with the canvas?
Nothing, unfortunately. Dispatch checked with records. Victim's got a wife.
Is Mary Seaman the woman in red? We don't know, but we're going to have to find Mary Seaman to find out what she can tell us about her husband, James.
Hey, Joe, you and your guys hold down the fort. We're gonna go look into this.
You got it.
Can I help you?
Man, we're with CSPD. We're looking for Mary Seaman.
I'm Mary.
The investigators take one look at her and realize she cannot be the woman in red. Mrs. Seaman is not Hispanic, so now those investigators have to give her some very awful news.
Mary, I know this is hard. Do you know what your husband was doing earlier today?
No, I don't know. He hasn't actually been living here.
Mary tells police that she and James have been married for 5 years, but things have started to get a little bit rocky. And as a matter of fact, he moved out about a week ago.
Sorry to hear that.
We had issues in our marriage, but deep down, Jim's got a good heart. He works hard, and he gets along with most everybody.
She says that everybody knows him as Jim. He's a kind of a tough, blue-collar kind of guy, but generally he's got a sensitive side to him.
Do you know if he was having any problem?
About there being an issue with some guy who was working for him, but it didn't seem that serious.
Remember the guy's name?
He didn't say.
That, of course, is interesting, but there's really very little information there that's pursuable. So they ask her if Jim has any friends or associates who are Hispanic women.
I can't think of anybody like that. But I don't know who he's been hanging around lately. You'd be better off talking to his friend, John Gibson. That's who he's been staying with.
Thank you, Mary.
We'll see our sales out.
Sorry for your loss.
With no time to waste, detectives head to the home of Jim Seaman's new roommate.
We knew that was maybe a possible crime scene, so we needed to talk to Mr. Gibson.
Yeah. Mr. Gibson? Detective Anderson with CSPD. Why don't we take a look around your house?
My house? For what?
Your friend Jim was found murdered.
Jim? What the hell are you talking about?
Mr. Gibson is totally shocked at this news.
Mind if we take a look around?
Yeah. Go ahead. After he got home from work, I want to say maybe around 5 o'clock. All he did was shower and head right back out.
Gibson reports he was going to go to a graduation party at a house in the area that belonged to a friend of his named Rose.
You know who this Rose person is?
Yeah, I met her before, but I don't really know her.
You know what she looks like?
Oh, she's short, got long black hair.
Is she white?
Nah, she's Latina.
So Rose is a Hispanic female. Could she own a red jacket by any chance?
Do Do you know where Rose lives?
Yeah, over on Charwood.
Excuse me. Place is clear?
We could find no evidence of blood or any indication that there'd been a struggle, but it was obvious that this was not our crime scene.
Appreciate your cooperation.
Yeah.
Let's get a cruiser over there on Charwood.
Yes, sir.
At that point, we wanted to find Rose to see if she was the woman in the red jacket. But we also wanted to see if where she lived was possibly our crime scene.
Can I help you?
A woman answered the door. She matched the description.
Detectives with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Are you Rose?
Yes.
Rose what?
Trejo?
Is that your jacket?
We're standing talking to a Hispanic female, and over her shoulder we see a red jacket. Well, no. 2 and 2 often equals 4. We're standing on the right porch. This investigation begins with the discovery of 42-year-old Jim Seaman dying inside his own truck. A woman drove that truck to that fire station wearing a red jacket. The officers have found the Hispanic female and they see a red jacket.
Rose, did you drive Jim Seaman to the fire station in his truck this morning?
Yes.
So now they know. They've hit the jackpot.
Is Jim okay?
I'm afraid not. He's dead.
Oh, God. I swear, I don't know what happened.
So you won't mind if we take a look around?
Okay.
Keep an eye on it.
We knew this was a brutal stabbing, so we're suspecting there will be blood evidence at the scene.
They walk in this house, and it's fairly obvious that a major party had taken place. Empty red cups, beer cans, liquor bottles.
And looking at Rose's kitchen, there were dirty dishes everywhere, but there was one thing that really stood out.
Does that look weird to you?
Yeah, a little bit.
As soon as we saw the knife, which really appeared out of place,
Let's get that thing bagged.
You got it.
we immediately thought this could be our murder weapon.
As they continue to search the house,
Check this out.
Anderson notices something alarming at the top of the basement staircase.
What's that look like to you?
That's blood.
Got that right.
We are on third base at this moment.
Blood evidence downstairs. We'd find a bloodied shirt. We also saw a mop that appeared to be blood-stained.
There is smeared blood on the floor, as if the most incompetent user of a mop in the history of the world tried to clean up the floor for a few minutes.
Looks like we found our crime scene.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So Rose has a little more explaining to do about the source of all of this blood.
John, call dispatch. Let them know we got to get this crime scene processed.
Yes, sir.
As for you, we need you to tell us exactly what happened here today.
Okay.
Rose isn't stupid. She knows why they're asking her.
We were throwing a graduation party for a family friend, and things just got crazy.
She says it slowly escalated into an adult party, and everybody got pretty drunk.
And next thing I know, Jim stumbled out of the house. Oh my God. Oh, Jim, Jim. Jim. Oh my God, Jim. What the hell happened?
Rose said she saw that Jim was hurt. He was struggling to get into his pickup truck.
Move. Okay, I'll drive. Go. Scoot. Move.
She knew he needed help immediately.
We got in the truck, and I was going to take him to the hospital. But when I saw the fire station, I just figured that they'd help him faster.
Why didn't you stay with him at the fire station?
I didn't want to be involved.
Rose, you are involved in this. So your plan failed.
So how do you know Jim?
We haven't known each other long. I'm a painter, and we just met on a construction job a few months ago.
Were the two of you romantically involved?
No, nothing like that. Just friends.
As a matter of fact, Jim had confided in her that he still loved his wife and hoped they could work things out.
So you had nothing to do with Jim's death?
No, I swear to God, I wasn't involved.
At this point, we're thinking Rose probably is genuine.
They believe just with them about what she knows about this, but they don't believe she's responsible.
So then who did kill Jim?
I don't know. Everybody loves him. Some of the people at the party, they've even done drywall for him before.
So you didn't see him at all?
I only remember seeing him in the kitchen. He was playing dominoes.
By himself?
No, he was playing with Armando.
Armando who?
Alvarez.
Mondo?
You know him?
Yeah, I know him. I've arrested him several times. Guy's in and out of prison. Real piece of work.
Detectives wonder if a drunken game of dominoes might have spurred a sudden explosion of violence.
What you gonna do, Mondo?
Shut up, Jim.
Ooh. Wrong move.
Damn it, Jim.
It's too easy.
Cheating son of a bitch.
What did you say?
I said you cheated.
I didn't do Mondo. Just relax.
Melody take over, and Armando decides that Mr. Seaman needs to meet his maker. Could that be possible? Oh, yes, it could.
Gentlemen?
Hey, Joe. Long time no see.
So what do you guys got?
So we got a crime scene in the basement. Possible murder weapon is in the kitchen. We're gonna need this entire house processed.
Okay, what about her?
She's good. For now.
Go ahead and secure the house. Ma'am, come with me.
As the sun begins to rise, Anderson is ready to give his new suspect, Armando Alvarez, a wake-up call.
What do you want?
When police get to Armando Alvarez's house, they're greeted by this short little angry woman who is not in any mood to have police at her house.
We're looking for Armando Alvarez.
My husband ain't here.
No? And where is he?
Not here. What, you want to talk to him?
That's Mondo.
Armando, freeze!
They see a shadow darting across the hallway, and they push past her to go get Armando, and she goes off.
So the situation did get rather crazy very quick.
She's absolutely out of control. These are the right kind of folks that we want to talk to about somebody being stabbed to death. Investigators are trying to determine who stabbed Jim Seaman to death at a graduation party. They're focused on an ex-convict, Armando Alvarez. When they approach him at his home, his wife immediately attacks an officer unprovoked.
Damn it!
I'll kill you!
Drop the shoe! Drop the shoe! Drop it! Get on the ground. Stop. Calm down. Stop fighting.
So this is craziness happening in the entry hall of this house.
Hey, you! There. You! Take your head off! Hands on my wife! Knock it off! Down. Calm down.
Her husband sees police trying to subdue her. He gets angry.
Your head off!
So now we're trying to control him. At the same time, we're arresting his wife.
Son of a bitch, you didn't do nothing!
She assaulted a police officer. Send her to central booking.
Stand by.
Listen, if you want to help her, you need to help us.
Armando is not happy about all of this. His wife has been removed, and she's going to jail for second-degree assault in a police house.
What happened yesterday?
I went to a graduation party for my nephew.
You were there with Jim Seaman?
Jim? No, I worked drywall with him, but I didn't see him at the party.
Oh, that's interesting. Because we were told that you were there playing dominoes together.
So unless you play dominoes wearing a blindfold, Armando, we're going to assume that you're lying through your teeth.
Look, there were a lot of people at the party, okay? Only whoever said that, or they got me confused with somebody else.
So you're saying you have no idea who stabbed Jim?
I didn't even know if Jim got stabbed. Probably I left before that even happened.
This is the typical response you get from people with a criminal past. Nobody ever knows anything.
Well, since you probably have nothing to hide, you don't mind if we take a look around, do you?
I guess.
Take a look.
We're searching this house looking for bloody clothing, a knife, any other similar item that may connect him directly to this offense.
Got nothing.
We don't find anything of any evidentiary value. We know he's not telling the truth, but we don't have enough to...
Not really. You might hear from us soon.
What about my wife?
Feel free to post a bell whenever you want.
After striking out with Armando, detectives rethink their approach.
Jim's wife, Mary, had told us that she knew of a minor altercation at work with a coworker. We know Armando did work for Jim, so it becomes important for us to get more information from the construction site.
Jim? He's a top-notch guy. He's been doing drywall on my sites for a few years now. He and his crew always do good work.
At the construction site, we do talk to Ron Hopper, and he tells us that he hired Jim to be the foreman of the drywall crew.
How many guys were working for him on his most recent job?
There were 3 of them. Keno, Rufus, and Armando.
Know of any recent problems between Armando and Jim?
Between Jim and Armando? No, not that I can recall. But you know, there was a minor issue between Jim and Keno the other day.
Ron says the source of conflict between Keno and Jim was a paycheck.
Hey, Ron.
Hey, what's up, Keno?
Just about to grab my check.
Your check? Jim early this morning.
And you gave it to him?
Well, yeah. I mean, I figured you told him to swing by and grab it or something. And...
No way. I need that money now, man. I got people I gotta pay.
Well, I mean, Jim said he's going to another work site this afternoon. I'm sure you could find him there. And...
Man, I don't have time for this shit. Who the hell does Jim think he is?
Relax, Keno.
Bang!
Ran out of here all pissed off. And trust me, you don't want to be on Keno's bad side.
Why is that?
Guy can fly off the handle pretty easy.
Ron tells police that Keno has a very bad temper, especially when he's been drinking, and it can turn violent.
Wouldn't be surprised if he had words about it with Jim off-site.
What's Keno's last name?
Garcia.
Garcia. All right, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
So at this point, Keno emerges as a stronger suspect than Armando because Keno has a motive. So now the question is, was Keno Garcia at that party?
In search of some answers, Detective Anderson circles back to Rose Trejo.
Excuse me.
Can I help you?
Hi. Detective Anderson with CSPD. I'm looking for Rose Trejo. She said she was staying here.
My aunt, she left already.
Do you know when she'll be back? Were you at your aunt's party yesterday?
Yeah, it was terrible.
She reports, oh, I was there, and I remember Jim Seaman covered in blood.
Did you see what happened?
No, I just saw him stumbling around. I freaked out. I just ran out there as quickly as I could.
Let me ask you something. You know who Keno Garcia is?
Keno? Yeah, why?
Did you happen to see him at the party?
Yeah, I saw Keno right before that whole incident with Jim happened. I saw him go into the basement.
Really?
Wow. Not only does she put the man with a motive at the party, she puts him in close contact to the victim shortly before his injuries took place. That is important.
After Rose's niece drops this bombshell, Anderson sets out to learn more about their new prime suspect.
Hey, Anderson. I was over at Records, and Duffy asked if I could drop this off to you.
Is that the Garcia file?
Sure is.
Man, look at his record.
We do a background check, and we find that he is a convicted felon. He's been on parole, and he was last arrested for robbery and aggravated assault.
You think that might be your guy?
Very well might be.
This is all Kemp planning to do. So we've learned that Jim Seaman had a recent confrontation with one of his drywall workers, and this drywall worker is currently on parole from the state penitentiary. It's time to go speak to him and find out what he has to say about this.
Mr. Garcia, thank you for meeting with us.
Yeah, I'm used to it.
So tell us about your relationship with your colleague, Jim Seaman.
Jim was my homie. I can't believe what happened to him. It's terrible.
Keno tells police that Jim's a great guy to work with, and he doesn't really have any problems with him.
Well, if that's the case, then tell us what happened between you and him regarding your paycheck.
At the work site? No, man. That was nothing. Not a problem.
He explains that he blew that completely out of proportion. He said it was no big deal, that they've talked about it, it's behind them.
So you didn't have any words with Jim in the basement at Rose's party the other day?
No, man. We were good. And besides, I never even went in the basement.
Any ideas how Jim got stabbed?
I went outside before that even happened. When I came back, everyone was going nuts.
Right.
So he just left, just got there, or were in the bathroom when somebody was killing Jim Seaman.
Just got a small problem with that. Because someone told us that they saw you go downstairs just moments before Jim was stabbed.
What? Who told you that?
Well, someone we've been talking to. Someone who saw you.
I don't know. I had a lot to drink, you know?
We confront him that we do have an eyewitness that puts him downstairs, and he begins to backtrack.
So now you could have been in the basement.
I don't know. But if I was down there, I definitely didn't see what happened.
Well, if you're in the basement, then surely you saw something.
Garcia's face collapses, and he realizes his story is crumbling before his eyes. And then all of a sudden, he just drops his head and says,
Look, I swear I didn't kill Jim, but I can't be no snitch, man.
So you're telling us that you know who killed Jim?
I'm saying I'm done talking.
Is he trying to protect someone who did this, or is he only trying to protect himself? Could be either one.
This is how it's going to be, Keno? Fine. Come on. You're free to go.
I am?
Yeah.
At this point, we decide to let Keno go. We don't think we have enough to hold him, and we certainly don't have enough to...
I want to track his every move.
Good thinking. You got it.
Anderson wants to be in a better position with Keno Garcia and return to him when he has more leverage against him, either through other witnesses or other information he may be able to develop.
In the meantime, detectives continue to search for new information from Seaman's colleagues at work.
If they can find that person who has more loyalty to Mr. Seaman than they have to their associates, they may loosen this. So they go find the third member they haven't talked to in this drywall crew, and that's Rufus Medina.
Mr. Medina.
Yes?
I'm Detective Anderson with the Colorado Springs Police Department. I'd like to talk to you for a minute about Jim Seaman.
Jim? Yeah, of course. Hey, go play a mommy for a little bit, okay?
Detective Anderson is thinking perhaps we've met someone who's loyal to Mr. Seaman. This guy looks like a genuine family man.
You know, it's just real awful what happened to Jim. Someone like him didn't deserve to die that way.
Well, that's why we're doing everything we can to figure out what happened to him. Were you at the party the other day?
I was, and to be honest, I had a few myself. I remember hearing some screaming, but that's about it.
So Rufus Medina's there, but I didn't see anything guy that everybody else has been.
So what do you know about the issue with the paycheck between Jim and your coworker, Keno?
It's water under the bridge as far as I know.
You don't think Keno had it out for him?
Keno? No way. Keno would never do something like that.
He then says, if I know who hurt him, I would tell you. And I have no idea who hurt Jim Seaman.
But you know what? If I hear anything, you'll be the first person to know, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Rufus does come off somewhat credible. The problem is that everybody we've talked to deny knowing anything. This is one of those situations where everybody is lying.
The first thing you learn as a police detective is people do not respond out of a sense of duty. They don't respond to doing the right thing. They respond to pressure.
But where will that pressure come from? A few days later, Anderson finds his answer.
Anderson. Yeah, put her through. We got somebody on the line saying they know something about the Jim Seaman case.
Hello?
At this point in the investigation, we got an anonymous phone call from a woman who claimed to be at the party.
Did you see what happened to Jim Seaman?
She saw Jim Seaman come up out of the basement, covered in blood, and he shouted, "Rufus, you son of a bitch."
You heard Jim say that?
Yeah, he was shouting it. Then I looked down the basement steps, and that's when I saw him.
The anonymous caller said that she looked past Jim down the bottom of the stairs and saw Rufus. He was covered with blood, raging with anger.
Rufus Medina?
Yeah. Rufus was really the last name that police thought they would hear.
We've finally stirred this nest enough to where there are enough hornets now that are buzzing. We're getting very close to who's responsible for this crime. All this time, we've been focusing on a couple of different people, and an anonymous phone tip has provided a new suspect, that Rufus Medina, Mr. I don't know who hurt Jim Seaman, is the guy who killed him.
But before zeroing in on Rufus, detectives hope to reap the rewards of an earlier strategy.
We decide we want to go back to Keno. It appears that he's violated his parole, so we think Ruth.
Do you know why you're back here, Mr. Garcia?
No idea.
Keno, we understand you're in violation of your parole.
We've got you drinking and hanging around convicted felons.
Listen, Keno, you've got two options. I can either call your parole officer and have you sent back to the state pen in a heartbeat, or you can help us understand who killed Jim Seaman.
There's always a limit to your loyalty and always a limit to your willingness to continue with the code of silence. Parole violation is a serious limit.
Okay. All right. I was in the basement when Jim got stabbed. But I swear to God, it wasn't me.
Okay, tell us what happened.
We were all in the basement.
Who was?
Me, Rufus, Armando, and Jim.
Keno says they're talking to Seaman about work, and everybody's really drunk, and everybody's kind of a little angry.
We're all yelling back and forth. That's when I saw Rufus pull the knife.
He said all of a sudden, Rufus Medina attacks Seaman like a wild animal.
Keno says he tried to get the knife away, but it was too late. Jim had already been stabbed several times.
Then Jim took his shirt off and staggered up the steps.
You're telling us that Rufus stabbed him. How would Rufus do that?
I don't know, man.
He said, well, I was pretty drunk. I don't remember what was said just before Rufus went off, but Rufus went off.
Are we good now?
Not exactly. I have to hold you for the time being.
Officer?
What Keno Garcia is saying certainly matches well with the anonymous phone call, but they're going to need more than the accusation of a known criminal to get a conviction on Rufus Medina. They want a statement from Rufus. They want him to say what he did.
Before sitting down with Rufus Medina, detectives dig into his background and make some interesting discoveries.
We do find out that he, like his two buddies, is also on parole.
He's not the saint that they thought he might be. He has a violent background, and he's somebody that obviously could have done this.
So we bring in Rufus Medina. He remains very calm. He's an experienced criminal.
Guys, look, I'd love to help you, but I promise I was never down in that basement.
That's not what we were told.
I don't know where you guys are getting this stuff. Jim was my friend, and I would never hurt him.
Have Jim Seaman, he doesn't know who did.
So is this how you want to play it? Fine. But mark my words. If I find out that you killed Jim Seaman, I'm going to put you away for it.
Although we probably had enough to arrest Rufus, we know our witnesses are not credible, and we do have a problem with some of the evidence. So we decide to not arrest him at that point.
Rufus, we don't forgive, and we don't forget. You should keep that in mind.
As the investigation continues into the summer, a familiar face is transferred back to Homicide.
Hey, sir.
I had returned to Homicide, and as a supervisor, I'm responsible for the actual closure of the case.
So where are we at with the Seaman case?
Nobody's story stays consistent. Everyone's telling something different. You know how it goes.
Okay. Right. You think it's time we start subpoenaing some of these people?
No point in wasting any more time.
All right.
We decided to impanel a grand jury. So we began serving subpoenas to the people at the party to induce them to come in and cooperate on the record, felony for perjury.
As a result of that pressure, they all testify, and one by one, they all name Rufus Medina as the person who killed Jim Seaman.
After that grand jury, we got a much better picture now of what happened at Rose's house.
Seaman comes to this party after he gets off work. The party is well attended, and everybody is juiced. They've been drinking all afternoon.
It's game. Man, this is too easy. Still can't believe that son of a bitch took my check like that.
Oh, he didn't tell you anything about it?
No, man, I needed that money right away, too.
They're still discussing that paycheck incident.
First he takes our checks, and then he holds our money? Who does this guy think he is?
I don't know.
And Rufus is getting more and more agitated that he needs to back up his man Kino.
Let's teach this gringo a lesson. Hey, Jim, Mondo, let's go downstairs. I want to show you guys something.
Sure thing, amigo. When we come back up, I'm gonna make it 2 in a row.
Yeah.
What you guys got down here? Oh, you're breaking up the black label? All right.
Why are you such a Jim? The money, man. Why are you messing with people's lives?
The paycheck, man! Oh, Kino. I thought we already talked about this. I needed that money right away, man.
Just because you run everything, you can just hold up money from us?
I'm sorry, man. I was just trying to be helpful. I wasn't trying to screw you out of anything.
Jim tries to stop the argument, apologizes, but it was obvious that Rufus and Kino didn't want an apology. They wanted something else.
I'm a man, Holmes. And treat me like a little kid. Whoa. Don't you touch me, man. Hey, don't touch me. I know that you're pissed off, but don't put your hands on me, okay?
So Kino and Seaman get involved in a shoving match, but before punches start to be thrown...
You think you're better than us? You're done, man. You're done!
Rufus! Rufus!
Medina just goes off into a wild, animalistic rage. He stabs him in the chest, and he turns to get away from the blade. He stabs him in the back. So Seaman pulls his shirt off and staggers up the stairs.
You should have paid us, you piece of... That's what you get! You should have gave us our money!
Jim staggers out to his truck. Rose helps him into the truck and drives him to the fire station.
The grand jury indicted Rufus Medina for 1 count of first-degree murder, and no charges were filed against anyone else who testified in front of the grand jury.
8 months later, Rufus Medina pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
Rufus Medina apologized.
On the afternoon of Saturday, February 11th, 2023, there was nothing about Culcheth Linear Park that suggested a tragedy was waiting inside it. It was an ordinary winter afternoon in Cheshire. The trees stood bare against the pale February sky. The paths through the park stretched between patches of woodland and open grass, damp beneath the footsteps of anyone passing through. In winter, the landscape had a quietness to it. Not the thick leaves and families fill the paths, but a colder kind of silence. The kind that makes every distant figure seem separate from you. For most people, it was simply another Saturday. For 16-year-old Brianna Gay, it was supposed to be a meeting. A simple meeting. Someone she knew had asked her to come to the park. There was nothing about that invitation that should have sounded like a death sentence. There was no warning attached to it. No message telling her to stay away. No stranger waiting in the shadows with a weapon in his hand. There was only a plan. And Brianna did not know that the plan had been made around her. She did not know that two teenagers had already discussed killing someone. She did not know that her name had become part of those conversations. She did not know that one of the people connected to the plan was someone she already knew. And she could not have known that the person helping bring her to the park was not simply arranging a meeting. She was leading her toward an ambush. That is what makes the story of Brianna Gay so difficult to understand. The killer was not a stranger emerging from an unknown world. There was no random encounter on an empty road. There was no sudden argument between two people who had never met. Instead, the path toward Brianna's death had been built slowly, through conversations, messages, relationships, resentment, obsession, and fantasy. The people involved, they were still children by almost any ordinary measure of life. They were young enough to be living under the supervision of adults. Young enough to be sitting in classrooms, worrying about homework, friendships, and the complicated social world of adolescence. Yet behind the ordinary surface of teenage life, something deeply disturbing had been developing. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe had been communicating about violence and murder for weeks. Their conversations would later become some of the most important evidence in one of the most disturbing murder trials in modern Britain. Those messages would allow investigators to look backward in time, to reconstruct the planning, to see how an idea became a possibility, how a possibility became a plan, and how that plan eventually became a real meeting in a winter park. But on that afternoon, Brianna knew none of this. She simply went. And somewhere along those paths, the ordinary world that she knew was about to disappear. Brianna was 16 years old. 16 is an age that is difficult to describe without thinking about everything that still lies ahead. At 16, the future is usually measured in possibilities rather than endings. There are friendships that might last for years. Places that have not yet been visited. People who have not yet been met. Mistakes that have not yet been made. Dreams that may still change. Brianna had a life beyond the headlines that would eventually carry her name across Britain and around the world. She had a family. She had people who knew her as Brianna, not as a case file. People who knew the way she spoke, the things that made her laugh, the things that frustrated her, the moments when she wanted to be alone, and the moments when she wanted someone beside her. To strangers, she would eventually become the 16-year-old girl found dead in a Cheshire park. But to the people who loved her, she was never a headline. She was Brianna. And that distinction matters, because true crime has a way of turning human beings into evidence. A photograph becomes an exhibit. A text message becomes a piece of prosecution evidence. A location becomes a crime scene. A birthday becomes a date in a timeline. A life becomes a sequence of events leading toward a final moment. But Brianna's life did not begin on February 11th, 2023. And it did not exist for the purpose of becoming a murder case. She was a teenager trying to navigate the complicated world of adolescence while also living openly as a transgender girl. That part of her identity would later become central to the public discussion surrounding her death. But Brianna was more than the circumstances of her murder. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with an afternoon. She was simply a 16-year-old going to meet people she believed she could trust. That belief would cost her everything. The first great question in the case is therefore not simply who killed Brianna. It is something more unsettling. How did two teenagers reach the point where killing her became something they could plan? The answer does not fit neatly into a single explanation. There was violence in their conversations. There was fascination with murder. There were disturbing fantasies. There was hostility. There were interpersonal tensions. There was an obsession with the idea of killing. And there were differences between the two teenagers that would become increasingly important during the trial. For Ratcliffe, the prosecution presented evidence that hostility toward Brianna's transgender identity formed part of the motive. For Jenkinson, the picture was different. Evidence suggested an intense preoccupation with violence and murder, along with a complicated emotional relationship with Brianna. These motives did not exist in isolation. They overlapped. They changed. They were expressed through messages typed on phones by teenagers who may never have imagined that one day every word would be read aloud in a courtroom. That is one of the haunting features of the case. The digital world preserves things that people once believed were private. A message can disappear from a soul who had it, but somewhere a record may remain. And when investigators eventually obtained those records, they did something extraordinary. They turned the invisible past into a map. They could look at what had been said before the murder. They could identify conversations about killing. They could examine plans. They could compare what the teenagers claimed afterward with what they had written beforehand. And slowly, the story of February 11th began to take shape. But before investigators saw that story, Brianna had to be found. At first, there was no murder scene. There was only a missing girl. That distinction would change everything. When a 16-year-old does not come home, the first instinct is not to think about murder. Families hope for an explanation that is frightening but temporary. Maybe she has gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe her phone has died. Maybe she needs space. Maybe there has been a misunderstanding. The human mind resists the darkest possibility because accepting it means crossing a psychological line that cannot easily be crossed back. But as the hours passed, concern became something more serious. Brianna had not simply gone somewhere. She was missing. And somewhere inside Culcheth Linear Park, the truth was waiting. Investigators would eventually discover that the location was not chosen by accident. The park was an ordinary world. A place where two people could meet a girl without immediately attracting attention. A place where a plan that had existed on phones and in conversations could become physical. The tragedy of that location is almost unbearable in its simplicity. A public park is supposed to be a place people pass through. Children play there. People walk dogs. Families spend afternoons there. Teenagers meet friends. The paths lead somewhere. The trees stand quietly. Life moves around the people who enter. But on this particular day, the park became the final destination in Brianna's life. The meeting had been arranged. Brianna arrived. Jenkinson was there. Ratcliffe was there. And whatever uncertainty had existed in the minds of the teenagers before that moment was about to become irreversible. There are moments in a murder investigation when time seems to split in two. Before and after. For Brianna, that division was absolute. Before the meeting, there was still a future. After the attack, there was only investigation. There was no second chance. No opportunity to go back and send a different message. No opportunity to choose another route. No chance to hear the invitation and decide not to go. Everything that had once seemed ordinary about that afternoon would later be examined under a microscope. The meeting. Who knew what? Who arrived first? What did they say? What did Brianna believe was going to happen? What had the two teenagers already decided? And most importantly, when did the plan become a decision? The answers would emerge slowly. Police would follow the digital trail. They would examine relationships. They would question people. They would reconstruct movements. They would examine evidence recovered from the investigation. And eventually, the focus would narrow. Two 15-year-olds. Two teenagers who had been connected to Brianna. Two people whose names had existed in the background of her ordinary life. Scarlett Jenkinson. Eddie Ratcliffe. At first, their identities could not simply be broadcast to the public. Because British law treats children accused of crimes differently from adults, the teenagers were referred to during the proceedings as Girl X and Boy Y. Those names sounded almost abstract. Girl X. Boy Y. But behind those labels were two real teenagers, sitting in court while evidence about their private conversations was examined. And behind those proceedings was a 16-year-old girl who would never walk into a courtroom. That imbalance would define the case. The defendants could speak. They could explain. They could deny. things. Her story had to be reconstructed by other people, by investigators, by prosecutors, by witnesses, by digital evidence, by the people who had known her, and by the evidence left behind by the 2 teenagers accused of killing her. The most disturbing evidence would come from the very place where modern teenage life increasingly happens. A phone screen, messages, words typed late at night. Ideas that might once have disappeared into the darkness after being spoken aloud could now be recovered and examined line by line. The investigators would discover that this was not simply a case of 2 teenagers meeting Brianna and suddenly losing control. The evidence pointed somewhere darker. There had been discussions about killing before Brianna was murdered. There had been fascination with violence. There had been planning. And crucially, there had been a decision to involve Brianna. That transformed the case. A spontaneous act is frightening. A planned act is frightening in a different way. Planning requires time. Time creates opportunities to stop. A person can have an idea and reject it. A person can write a message and delete it. A person can make a plan and walk away. But here, according to the evidence later presented in court, the planning continued. The idea survived. A real girl was placed at the center of them. Brianna, the 16-year-old who walked into a park believing she was meeting people. The girl whose family would soon be waiting for her to come home. The girl whose photograph would appear on television screens. The girl whose name would become known across Britain. And the girl whose murder would force a country to confront uncomfortable questions about violence, adolescence, transgender identity, online communication, psychological vulnerability, and the disturbing ways in which violent fantasies can move from imagination into reality. But before any of those questions could be asked, there was only the missing girl. A family waiting, a community searching, a park, and a truth that had not yet been discovered. The first hours after Brianna disappeared were filled with uncertainty. People did not yet know what had happened. They did not know that the girl they were searching for was already dead. They did not know that the people responsible were not distant criminals who had vanished into the night. They did not know that the answers would eventually lead back to 2 teenagers. And they certainly did not know how much evidence had already been left behind. Because the killers had not only left physical traces, they had left words. And words have a strange power in a murder investigation. A footprint can fade. But a message can preserve a moment exactly as it was written. A sentence sent before the crime can become evidence after the crime. A casual conversation can suddenly reveal itself as a warning. A joke can become a confession of intent. A plan can become a timeline. And in this case, the phones of 2 15-year-olds would eventually open a door into a world that Brianna had never known existed. A world in which her death had been discussed before she was killed. A world in which people she knew had been imagining violence. A world in which the invitation that brought her into Culcheth Linear Park was not what it appeared to be. That is where the story becomes more than a murder mystery. It becomes a question about what can happen when obsession is allowed to grow in silence. When violent fantasies are treated as entertainment. When resentment becomes fixation. When another human being is gradually reduced to an object inside someone else's imagination. And when 2 young people, both still teenagers themselves, cross a line from talking about murder to carrying out a murder. There is another question, perhaps even harder to answer. Could anyone have seen it coming? Could a message have been interpreted differently? Could someone have noticed a change? Could an adult have recognized the warning signs? Could Brianna have been protected? These questions would remain after the trial. They would be asked by experts, by the public, and most painfully by people who loved Brianna. But on February 11th, none of those questions had answers. There was only the afternoon, the invitation, the journey, the park, and Brianna, a 16-year-old girl walking toward a meeting she believed was ordinary. She had no reason to imagine that the people waiting for her had already imagined her death. She could not see the future. She could not read the messages that had been exchanged without her knowledge. She could not know what had been planned. And she could not know that the next few minutes would become the final moments of her life. The trees remained still. The paths remained open. The world outside the park continued as normal. Cars moved along nearby roads. People went about their Saturday. Somewhere, phones continued to ring. Somewhere, families continued eating lunch. Somewhere, another teenager was probably complaining about homework, laughing with a friend, scrolling through a phone, thinking about the next day. That is what makes tragedy so cruel. The world does not stop when one person's world ends. For Brianna, everything was about to stop. For everyone else, Saturday would continue. And when the truth finally emerged, Britain would ask how two 15-year-olds could plan. The answer would not come from one piece of evidence. It would come from thousands of fragments. Messages. Relationships. Movements. Contradictions. Psychological clues. And eventually, the words of the two teenagers themselves. But first, investigators had to find Brianna. And before they could understand why she was dead, they had to reconstruct how she had arrived at that park in the first place. The investigation would begin with a missing girl. It would end with 2 life sentences. Between those 2 points lay one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent British history. A case in which the suspects were children. A case in which the victim was 16. A case in which a friendship became a pathway to betrayal. A case in which a private fantasy became a real murder. And a case in which a handful of messages, typed by teenagers who could never have imagined the full weight of their own words, would help reveal the truth. On that cold February afternoon, Brianna walked into Culcheth Linear Park. She did not know she was walking into history. She did not know her name would soon be spoken in courtrooms, newsrooms, and homes across the country. She did not know that strangers would study photographs of her and ask who she had been. She did not know that people who had never met her would mourn her. And she did not know the chain of decisions that led to her death. All Brianna knew was that she was meeting someone. And somewhere ahead of her, 2 teenagers were waiting. The distance between them was only a few paths through a winter park. But between Brianna's final ordinary moment and the truth that investigators would eventually uncover was an entire hidden world. A world of messages. A world of plans. A world of obsession. A world that Brianna never saw coming. And once the first message was opened, once the first lie was uncovered, once investigators began tracing the final hours of her life, the question would no longer be whether Brianna had simply disappeared. The question would become something much darker. Who had brought her there? Why had they chosen her? And how long had they been planning for the moment when a 16-year-old girl would step onto that path, unaware that she had just walked into a trap? The answer was already there, waiting inside the phones, waiting inside the messages, waiting inside the memories of the people who had known her, waiting beneath the surface of an ordinary February afternoon, and waiting, finally, for someone to put the pieces together. There is something unsettling about the final ordinary moments of a person's life. They rarely look important while they are happening. There is no invisible clock hanging above the road. No warning that this is the last time they will ever walk through a particular doorway, send a particular message, see a particular face, or breathe the cold air of an ordinary afternoon. The moment does not announce itself. It simply passes. And that is what happened to Brianna Gay. On February 11th, 2023, she was 16 years old. She was not walking into the park believing that she was approaching the final chapter of her life. She was walking toward a meeting. Somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of that day, there were probably thoughts that had nothing to do with death. The kind of thoughts teenagers have every day. What someone had said earlier. What someone might say next. Whether a person could be trusted. Whether a friendship was changing. What would happen after the weekend? The future was still there in front of her, wide and unfinished. 16 years old means that almost everything is still waiting to happen. The first years of adulthood. The decisions that will shape a career. The friendships that will survive adolescence. The people who will eventually become strangers. The people who have not yet entered your life. Places you have never seen. A version of yourself that you have not yet become. For Brianna, all of those possibilities were still ahead. Then she walked toward Culcheth Linear Park. And somewhere within that same landscape, another future had already friendships or adulthood. A future in which she would become the target of a plan. The most disturbing part was not simply that 2 teenagers wanted to hurt someone. It was that they had spent time talking about murder before Brianna's death. The idea had existed before the victim did. That distinction is important, because it means the violence did not begin with the attack in the park. The attack was the final physical expression of something that had been developing privately. Words came first. Ideas came first. Fantasy came first. then planning, then a victim, then the meeting, then the irreversible moment when imagination became reality. Investigators would later discover that Jenkinson and Ratcliffe had communicated about murder and violence over a period of weeks. At 15 years old, they were discussing things most teenagers would never seriously contemplate. The conversations contained disturbing fantasies and an interest in killing. At some point, however, the abstract idea of murder began to move closer to the real world. The question was no longer simply whether they could imagine killing someone. The question became whether they would actually do it. And then Brianna's name entered the picture. There is a particular cruelty in that transition. A fantasy about an unnamed person can remain distant. The moment a real name is to collapse, a person is no longer an imaginary figure. A person has a face, a voice, a family, a history, a phone number, a bedroom, a daily routine, a life. Brianna was not an idea. She was a real 16-year-old girl, and she knew one of the people involved. That familiarity would become one of the most important elements of the case. Because danger often feels different when it comes from someone familiar. A stranger can trigger instinctive caution. Someone you know can pass through the defenses that exist for strangers. A familiar name appearing on a phone screen does not necessarily produce fear. An invitation from someone you know does not automatically sound like a trap. Trust works precisely because it lowers the barriers between people. And on that Saturday, trust became part of the path that brought Brianna into the park. Scarlett Jenkinson knew Brianna. The two girls were connected socially. That connection mattered. Jenkinson could communicate with Brianna in a way a complete stranger could not. She could make an invitation seem ordinary. She could make a meeting seem believable. And according to the evidence presented during the trial, she played an important role in bringing Brianna to the location where Ratcliffe was waiting. There is something a suggestion, a meeting, a place, one decision following another. No single step necessarily looked like the moment everything changed. But together, those steps formed a path. And Brianna walked down it. The park itself was not sinister. That matters too. True crime stories often turn locations into symbols after something terrible has happened there. A house becomes the murder house. A road becomes the place where someone disappeared. A forest becomes the place where a body was found. But before the crime, these places are usually ordinary. Culcheth Linear Park was an ordinary public space. People walked there. People passed through. The landscape did not know what was coming. Trees do not understand human intention. Paths do not know why someone is walking along them. A bench cannot recognize a killer. A park can contain a tragedy without ever looking like the kind of place where tragedy belongs. That contrast would later become impossible to ignore. A beautiful or ordinary place can become permanently associated with something horrific. But on that afternoon, the park remained simply a park. Brianna entered it. The people responsible for her death were there. And the distance between an ordinary meeting and a murder was closing. When everything became inevitable. But real criminal cases are rarely that clean. There are decisions. There are opportunities to stop. There are moments of hesitation. There are conversations that could have gone differently. There are people who could have walked away. That is one reason planned murders are so disturbing. They contain time. Time to think. Time to reconsider. Time to understand the consequences. And yet, according to the evidence heard at trial, the plan continued. The teenagers did not simply encounter Brianna by accident. They had arranged for her to be there. And the park became the place where the plan would be carried out. Brianna's final hours would later be reconstructed piece by piece. Investigators would examine her movements. They would look at communications. They would identify the people she had been in contact with. They would establish when she left, where she went, who she was supposed to meet, and what happened after she disappeared. But at the beginning, investigators did not have the answers. They had a missing 16-year-old. And somewhere a family was waiting. There is a special kind of fear that begins when someone does not come home. At first, people wait. Then they check the phone. Then they call again. Then they ask questions. Where are you? Are you okay? Unanswered questions grow heavier with every passing hour. Eventually, hope and fear begin to exist side by side. Maybe she is safe. Maybe there is a simple explanation. But what if there isn't? For Brianna's family, that uncertainty would become unbearable. They did not know what investigators would eventually discover. They did not know that the search would lead to a park. They did not know that 2 teenagers would become central figures in the investigation. They did not know that messages already existed that could eventually reveal the planning behind the murder. They only knew that Brianna was not where she was supposed to be. And somewhere beyond the walls of the family home, the investigation was beginning. The first task was simple: find her. That meant searching. As the investigation developed, the public became aware that a teenage girl was missing. Her photograph circulated. People who had never met her learned her name. Searches were organized. Questions were asked. And the case began to move from a private family crisis into a public emergency. This is another painful contradiction at the center of the story. While people were searching for Brianna, the truth was already known to the people who had taken her life. The public was still hoping for her safe return. The investigators were still trying to determine what had happened. Her family of the investigation knew more than they were saying. That gap between what the world believed and what the killers knew would eventually become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because after a murder, the truth exists even when nobody else knows it. The victim knows it. The killer knows it. And everyone else is left trying to find it. In Brianna's case, that truth was hidden behind layers of ordinary teenage behavior. Messages. Friendships. Phone calls. Stories. Explanations. And lies. The investigation would eventually force those layers apart. But before that happened, there was another question. Why Brianna? Why her? Why had 2 15-year-olds chosen a 16-year-old girl they knew? The answer would prove complicated. There was no single motive that could completely explain both teenagers. The prosecution would present different psychological pictures of Jenkinson and Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe's hostility toward Brianna's transgender identity would become significant. Evidence would show attitudes that were deeply troubling and would contribute to the court's eventual finding that transphobia formed part of his motivation. But the story of Jenkinson was different. Her fascination with murder and violence was central to the prosecution's case. There were feelings of attachment. There was fear of losing the relationship. There was obsession. And there was a disturbing desire to see violence become real. Together, the 2 teenagers created something far more dangerous than either motive alone might suggest. One brought certain ideas. The other brought others. And somewhere in between those 2 worlds stood Brianna. The victim did not create the hatred. She did not create the obsession. She did not cause the fantasies. She simply became the person selected to carry them. That is a distinction that must never be lost. Because when a murder is described only through the motives of the perpetrators, there is a danger that the victim becomes secondary. Brianna should never be secondary. Everything in this story happened to her. She was the person whose future was stolen. She was the person whose family was left behind. She was the person whose name became attached to a case that would dominate British headlines. And she was 16. That fact should never become just another statistic. 16. A number that represents an age, but also a life. A teenager who had not yet reached adulthood. A person who had not yet had the opportunity to discover who she would become. And that is perhaps the hardest part of the entire case. We can reconstruct the murder. We can reconstruct the movements. We can identify the suspects. We can follow the evidence into a courtroom. But we cannot reconstruct the future Brianna should have had. That future simply disappeared. The investigation could identify what happened to her. It could punish the people responsible. It could establish facts. But it could never return what had been taken. As the search intensified, the park became more important. The place where Brianna had gone. The place where the final chapter of her life had unfolded. The place where investigators would eventually discover the answer to the question that everyone was asking. Where is Brianna? The answer would be devastating. And once it was found, the nature of the case would change immediately. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a murder investigation. The people searching for a missing teenager were now searching for evidence of what had happened to a murdered girl. The family waiting for Brianna to come home were now facing a reality that no family should ever have to face. And investigators had to confront an even darker question. Who could have done this? The answer would eventually point toward two teenagers. Two 15-year-olds. Two people who had been part of Brianna's world. That revelation would shock the public. Because there is something deeply uncomfortable about looking at a murder suspect barely old enough to understand the adult world. 15. Old enough, in this case, to plan. Old enough to communicate. Old enough to deceive. Old enough to understand that what they were discussing was murder. But still young enough to be considered a child under the law. That contradiction would follow the case all the way into the courtroom. What should society do when the people responsible for an extraordinary act of violence are themselves teenagers? How much responsibility belongs to them? How much should age matter? Can someone so young understand the consequences of killing another human being? And if they can, what does that mean about the world that produced them? These questions would come later. First came the evidence. And evidence has no emotion. It does not care about age. It does not care about appearance. It does not care whether someone looks frightened in an interview or cries in court. It simply exists. A message exists. A location exists. A movement can be traced. A contradiction can be identified. A story can be compared against what actually happened. And as detectives began putting those pieces together, the image of what had happened to Brianna became clearer. The teenagers had not simply found themselves in a terrible situation. They had moved toward it. They had talked about it. They had planned it. The great shock of the case was that Brianna was dead. The second was how young the people accused of killing her were. The third was the discovery that the murder had been planned. But perhaps the most haunting element was this. The evidence existed before the crime was solved. The words were already there. The plan had already been documented. The digital trail was waiting. Every message sent between the teenagers had the potential to become a piece of the truth. They may have believed they were speaking privately. They may have believed that what happened on a phone screen would remain inside that screen. But digital conversations can outlive the people who write them. And once police had access to those conversations, the past began to speak. Not through a confession. Not through a dramatic revelation. But through fragments. A sentence here. A message there. A plan. A contradiction. A reference to violence. A detail that should not have been known. One piece after another. Until the investigators could begin to see what had happened before Brianna ever entered the park. And that is where this story begins to turn. Because the search for Brianna would soon become a search through the private world of two 15-year-olds. A world that, on the surface, might have looked like the ordinary chaos of adolescence. But beneath that surface was something else. Something darker. Something that had already crossed from imagination into intention. The final meeting in Culcheth Linear Park was not the beginning. It was the end of a process. And the process had begun weeks earlier. By the time Brianna arrived at the park, the most important decisions had already been made. The location had been chosen. The meeting had been arranged. The victim had been identified. And the people responsible had already imagined what they intended to do. Brianna could not see any of that. She could only see the people in front of her. She could only know what she had been told. And perhaps that is the most painful image to carry from this entire case. A 16-year-old girl walking through an ordinary winter landscape, trusting that she was going somewhere for a reason that made sense. Behind her, the world she knew still existed. Ahead of her, two teenagers were waiting. Between those points was a short distance. But it was the final distance Brianna would ever travel. She would never walk back home. She would never send another message. She would never grow older. She would never reach 17. Or 18. Or 20. She would never discover the person she might have become. The world would continue without her. But before the world could understand what had happened, someone had to find the truth. And the truth was already waiting in the evidence. Messages. Waiting in the memories. Waiting at the park. Waiting for investigators to connect two 15-year-olds to a 16-year-old girl who had trusted one of them enough to follow an invitation. That was the beginning of the investigation. But for Brianna, it was the end. And as the search moved forward, the question that had started as a family's desperate plea would slowly become the central question of a murder investigation. What happened to Brianna Gay? The answer would expose a plan that had been forming long before that February afternoon. And once that plan was revealed, Britain would be forced to look beyond the crime itself. beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom, beyond the labels of girl X and boy Y, and toward something far more disturbing. How could two 15-year-olds look at another teenager's life and decide that it should end? How could an idea of murder become a plan? How could a plan become an appointment? And how could that appointment end with a 16-year-old girl never going home? Those questions would remain long after the investigators had left the park, long after the evidence had been collected, long after the courtroom doors had closed, and long after the names Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe became permanently connected to the name Brianna Gay. But on that February afternoon, none of those answers had yet been spoken. There was only a girl, teenagers, and a secret that had not yet been uncovered. The secret was already there. All that remained was for someone to find it. By the time the truth began to emerge, the afternoon of February 11th had already become something that could never be changed. But investigations do not begin with certainty. They begin with fragments. A person who does not come home. A phone that stops responding. A family trying to make sense of silence. A location that suddenly matters. And questions. Always questions. Where did she go? Who was she with? Why did she go there? Who knew she was going? Who was the last person to see her? And perhaps the question that matters most in any missing person investigation. Was she in danger? In Brianna's case, the answer was already yes. She had been in danger before she knew she was in danger. That is one of the most disturbing characteristics of the case. The danger did not announce itself. It did not look like danger. It looked like a message from someone she knew. It looked like a plan to meet. It looked like a normal teenage afternoon. The ordinary appearance of the situation was part of what made it possible. There are crimes in which the victim is confronted by an obvious threat. A stranger follows them. A door is forced open. An argument erupts. Visible moment when the victim understands that something is wrong. Brianna's story was different. The trap depended on familiarity. It depended on expectation. It depended on the belief that the person inviting her somewhere did not intend to hurt her. And that makes betrayal more difficult to comprehend than random violence. Because violence from a stranger can sometimes be understood through the simple concept of danger. Betrayal requires something else. It requires trust first. The person has to believe that they are safe. Only then can that safety be taken away. That afternoon, Brianna's trust became one of the weapons used against her. The person helping arrange the meeting was someone she knew. The location was public. The invitation did not necessarily look threatening. And yet, according to the evidence eventually presented in court, the meeting had been arranged because the two teenagers wanted Brianna there. Not to talk. Not to resolve a disagreement. Not to spend an ordinary afternoon together. They wanted her there because they had chosen her. The realization of that fact would later become one of the most chilling elements of the case. A human being had been selected. A 16-year-old girl had been transformed, inside the minds of two other teenagers, from a person into a target. And once that transformation happened, everything that before the murder would become crucial because they revealed something that the physical scene could not. They revealed intention. A crime scene can tell investigators what happened, but intention is often hidden. A person can stand over a victim after a spontaneous act and claim that they never meant for anyone to die. They can say they lost control. They can say they panicked. They can say something went wrong. But when the same people have discussed murder before the event, the investigation changes. The past begins to challenge the story of the present. That would happen here. The phones of Jenkinson and Ratcliffe contained a disturbing history. Their conversations were not simply about the practical details of meeting someone. They reflected an interest in murder and violence. There were discussions that, taken individually, might have been dismissed as fantasy. Teenagers can say shocking things. Teenagers can exaggerate. Teenagers can make reckless jokes. But investigators had to look at the whole picture. Because the problem was not simply that they had talked about killing. The problem was that someone eventually died. And the person who died was Brianna. That changed the meaning of everything that had come before. Words that might once have seemed like fantasy now became evidence. A conversation that might once have been dismissed as disturbing teenage behavior became part of a murder timeline. And the closer investigators looked, the harder it became to separate fantasy from intention. The prosecution would later argue that this was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was a plan. And plans have stages. There is the idea, then the discussion, then the decision, then the preparation, then the execution. The terrifying thing about Brianna's murder was that investigators could see evidence of several of those stages. The murder did not begin when the knife appeared. It began much earlier. It began in conversations no one outside that private circle knew about. It began in a psychological space that Brianna could not see. She was living in one reality. They were living in another. For Brianna, the invitation meant one thing. For the people who created it, it meant something entirely different. That gap between perception and reality would become central to understanding the crime. Imagine receiving a message from someone you know. You read the words. You understand what they appear to mean. You make a decision based on that understanding. You get ready. You leave. You travel. You arrive. At every stage, you are acting on information that you believe to be true. But what if the person who gave you that information already knows something it is? What if the people waiting for you have already decided what will happen? There is no defense against a threat you cannot perceive. And that is what makes the final journey so haunting. Brianna was not running from danger. She was walking toward a meeting. She did not know that the meeting had been designed around her death. She did not know that her name had already appeared in conversations about killing. She did not know that 2 teenagers were waiting for her. And she could not know that the park would become the last place she would ever see. The investigation would eventually reveal that the teenagers had chosen the location because it offered an opportunity to carry out their plan away from the immediate attention of other people. That detail matters because it shows the level of thought involved. The location was not simply where they happened to be. It was part of the plan. And once a location becomes part of a murder plan, an ordinary landscape takes on a completely different meaning. The path becomes a route. The trees become cover. The open spaces become risks. The meeting point becomes a stage. But nature itself remains indifferent. The trees do not move differently because a murder is about to happen. The sky does not darken because a life is about to end. The wind does not know. The people walking nearby do not know. The world continues. That is the strange cruelty of real crime, and something terrible is about to happen. Life does not pause. There is no soundtrack. There is no warning. A murder can occur while other people are buying groceries, while someone is driving home, while a family is preparing dinner, while another teenager is laughing with friends. The world can remain completely ordinary around an extraordinary act of violence. And that was true on the day Brianna died. Somewhere outside the park, people were living through a completely normal Saturday. Inside the park, a 16-year-old girl's life was approaching its final moments. The contrast is difficult to accept. It is easier to imagine a terrible place producing terrible things. An abandoned building. A dark alley. An isolated house. A dangerous neighborhood. But Culcheth Linear Park was not a symbol of evil. It was simply a place. The evil existed in the decisions of people. That distinction would become important, because the story was never really about a cursed location. It was about human choices. Choices made by 2 teenagers. Choices that had consequences far beyond anything they could undo. When investigators eventually began examining those choices, they would discover something else. The 2 defendants did not tell the same story. After the murder, both Jenkinson and Ratcliffe would offer explanations. Each would have a version of what had happened. And each would try to place more responsibility on the other. That would create a second battle. The first battle had been physical. The second would take place through evidence. Who had planned the murder? Who had intended to kill? Who had carried out the attack? Who knew what? Who had encouraged whom? Who was telling the truth? And who was lying? The answers would eventually come from a combination of evidence. But the most powerful evidence was not necessarily a dramatic confession. It was the accumulation of small details. The digital trail. The conversations. The movements. The relationships. The inconsistencies. The things the teenagers knew. The things they should not have known. And the things they had written before they had any reason to believe that investigators would ever read them. This is where the case becomes a study in the psychology of concealment. After a murder, people often try to control the story. They create explanations. They deny. They minimize. They shift blame. They claim they were somewhere else. They say they did not know. They say they were afraid. They say someone else was responsible. But the truth can be remarkably difficult to control when evidence exists in does not care who is lying. A location does not care who is frightened. A timeline does not care who wants it to be different. And a dead victim cannot contradict the story herself. That last point is perhaps the cruelest. Brianna could not sit in an interview room and tell detectives what she had been promised. She could not describe the messages she had received. She could not explain what she believed when she entered the park. She could not identify the exact moment she realized she was in danger. She could not point toward the person she believed she could trust. Investigators had to reconstruct those moments without her. That meant looking at everything she left behind. Her phone. Her communications. Her relationships. Her movements. And the people around her. Slowly, the investigation would begin to transform the final hours of Brianna's life into a sequence of events. A sequence that would eventually become evidence. But there was one thing the evidence could never explain completely. What did Brianna feel? That question has no perfect answer. We can reconstruct what happened. We can estimate where people were. We can read messages. We can understand the plan. But we cannot know exactly what was happening inside Brianna's mind in those final moments. And perhaps we should be careful about pretending that we can. True crime sometimes script. But real people do not think in scripted lines. They experience confusion, fear, disbelief, shock. They may try to understand what is happening. They may hope the situation is not what it seems. They may look at familiar faces and struggle to comprehend how those faces have suddenly become dangerous. Brianna's final moments should not be turned into entertainment. They should be understood as the final moments of a real human life. That is why the story must remain centered on her. Not on the spectacle of her death. Not on the fascination surrounding the killers. But on the fact that a young woman was alive one moment and gone the next because two other teenagers decided that she should die. The horror is in that decision. Not in the details of the violence. The horror is in the choice. And the choices had been made before Brianna arrived. This is also why the question of motive matters. People often want one simple answer. Was it hatred? Was it jealousy? Was it obsession? Was it fascination with murder? Was it because Brianna was transgender? Was it because of the relationship between the teenagers? The truth was more complicated. Courts are required to distinguish between evidence and speculation. And in this case, the evidence showed different motivations operating within the two defendants, Cliff's motivation. But it did not reduce the entire case to that single explanation. Jenkinson's motivations were different. Her fascination with murder and violence was significant. Her relationship with Brianna was significant. Her fear of losing Brianna was significant. Her psychological state was significant. These elements existed alongside one another. They created a dangerous combination. And somewhere inside that combination was the decision to make Brianna the victim. It is tempting to ask what might have happened if one conversation had gone differently. If one message had not been sent. If one person had changed their mind. If one person had refused to go to the park. If Brianna had stayed home. If someone had discovered the plan earlier. If an adult had recognized what the messages meant. These questions are understandable. But they lead into a world of possibilities that can never be proven. The only certainty is what happened. Brianna went to the park. She was attacked. She died. And two 15-year-olds were eventually convicted of her murder. Everything else exists around those facts. The investigation would uncover the route between them. And that route would expose a disturbing picture of adolescent violence. Not violence that appeared from nowhere. Violence that was discussed, imagined, shared, and eventually carried out. That is why the digital evidence became so important. In a traditional murder investigation, detectives might reconstruct a suspect's movements through witnesses, CCTV, fingerprints, physical evidence, and forensic testing. In a modern teenage murder case, there is another layer. The digital life. Messages can reveal relationships that witnesses never knew existed. They can reveal private fears, private fantasies, private resentments, and sometimes they reveal plans. The teenagers had left behind a record of their thoughts, and that record would eventually become one of the strongest voices in the courtroom. But before there was a courtroom, there was a search. Before there were prosecutors, there were detectives. Before there were verdicts, there was a missing girl. And before the public learned the names Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, there was only Brianna's name. Her family wanted her found. Her community wanted her found. People who had never met her wanted her found. At first, hope still existed. Perhaps she would return. Perhaps there would be an explanation. Perhaps the nightmare would end with a phone call saying she was safe. But as the investigation moved forward, that hope would become harder to sustain. The discovery of Brianna would transform the emotional landscape completely. There would be no moment when she walked through the door. Instead, there would be grief, questions, and eventually anger. The kind of anger that comes when people discover that a tragedy was not an accident. Someone chose it. Someone planned it. Someone carried it out. And two people who were still teenagers had been responsible. The public would struggle to reconcile those facts. So would the court. So would the people who had loved Brianna. Perhaps the most difficult image is not the crime scene. It is the image of a family waiting for a daughter who would never return. A phone that would never light up with another message from her. A bedroom that would remain exactly where it was. Clothes that would never be worn again. Plans that would never happen. A future that had been erased without warning. Those are the consequences of murder that never appear in police photographs. They exist in the empty spaces afterward. The empty chair. The unanswered message. The birthday that arrives without the person. The ordinary objects that suddenly become painful. The world remembers a murder through its evidence. A family remembers a person through everything that evidence can never capture. That is why Brianna's story deserves to be told carefully. She should not be remembered only for the way she died. She should be remembered for the fact that she lived. She was sick. She had relationships. She had hopes. She had a future. And she deserved to grow older. The people who killed her took that future away. The court could punish them. The investigation could establish the truth. But neither could restore what Brianna had lost. As the case moved forward, investigators would begin turning the final day into a timeline. The timeline would reveal who contacted whom, who arranged the meeting, who traveled to the park, who was present, what happened afterward, and eventually, why the two teenagers had chosen Brianna. But the first major revelation would come from something deceptively ordinary. A phone. A small device that had probably been used for thousands of normal teenage conversations. Messages about friends, plans, school, everyday life. And then, buried among those ordinary fragments, evidence of something extraordinary and terrible. Murder. The investigators would follow that trail. And when they did, they would discover that the story of Brianna's death had begun long before February 11th. It had begun in the private conversations of two teenagers who had no reason to believe that the world would ever read their words. They were wrong. The world would read them. A courtroom would, and those words would help reveal the truth. The final question of the hook is therefore not simply what happened to Brianna. It is what happened before. What happened inside the minds of two 15-year-olds before they ever entered the park. What did they imagine? What did they discuss? When did fantasy become intention? When did intention become planning? And when did Brianna become the person they were willing to sacrifice to make that plan real? Those answers were hidden in the days and weeks before the murder. And the deeper investigators went, the more disturbing the story became. Because the closer they came to the truth, the clearer one fact became. Brianna's death had not begun in the park. The park was simply where the hidden story finally became visible. The real beginning was somewhere else. It was inside conversations, inside relationships, inside the private digital world of two teenagers. And once detectives opened that door, there would be no way to close it again. The messages would speak. The timelines would speak. The evidence would speak. And eventually, the truth would speak for Brianna. But before that truth could be understood, we need to go back. Back before the murder. Back before the investigation. Back before the names Girl X and Boy Y appeared in court. Back to Warrington. Back to the landscape. Because to understand how a 16-year-old girl could become the center of such a horrific crime, we first have to understand who Brianna was. Not as a victim. Not as a photograph on a news report. Not as a name in a courtroom. But as a person. A daughter. A friend. A teenager. A young woman who had a life before the world learned how it would end. And that is where the next chapter begins. Before the park. Before the messages became evidence. Before the investigation. There was Brianna, and there was the ordinary life she deserved to continue living. To understand what happened to Brianna Gay, we have to begin somewhere quieter. Not with the knife. Not with the courtroom. Not with the messages that would later shock a jury. And not even with the moment Brianna entered Culcheth Linear Park. We have to begin with the place. Because places shape the way we imagine events. A crowded city street feels different from an empty country path. A railway station feels different from a school corridor. A shopping center feels different from a woodland trail. And Culcheth was not some anonymous point on a map. It was a real community with its own rhythm, its own streets, its own familiar faces, and its own ordinary Saturday afternoons. Culcheth is a village in Cheshire, residential streets, open countryside and green spaces that gives much of the area its distinctive character. It is the kind of place where the landscape can change within a relatively short distance. Houses give way to roads. Roads give way to fields. Fields give way to trees. And somewhere within that landscape was Linear Park. For people who knew the area, it was not a place associated with murder. It was simply part of the local environment. A place to walk. A place to pass through. A place where teenagers could meet. A place that belonged to everyday life. That ordinary quality would later make the crime feel even more difficult to comprehend. Because when people imagine a murder scene, they often imagine somewhere dark. Somewhere abandoned. Somewhere that already looks dangerous. But real violence does not require a sinister landscape. It can happen in a place that looks completely ordinary. The danger is carried by the people who enter it. And on February 11th, 2023, 3 teenagers entered that landscape. Brianna Gay was 16 years old. Scarlett Jenkinson was 15. Eddie Ratcliffe was 15. The 3 knew one another in different ways. Brianna and Scarlett knew each other from school. Scarlett and Eddie had been friends for years. That network of relationships is important because it changes the story of 3 strangers meeting in a remote place. It was a story that grew out of connections between young people. School. Friendship. Messages. Social relationships. The complicated world of adolescence. At 15 and 16, people live in a world where relationships can feel enormous. A friendship can feel like a lifeline. A disagreement can feel like a catastrophe. Being accepted can feel essential. Being rejected can feel unbearable. A message left unanswered can occupy an entire afternoon. A person who was your friend yesterday can feel like a stranger today. Teenage life is full of emotional intensity. But most of the time, that intensity passes. People argue. People reconcile. Friendships change. People grow up. The danger in Brianna's case was that the emotional world surrounding her had become entangled with something far darker. Murder. The contrast is difficult to process. The people at the center of this case were not hardened criminals in the conventional image of the word. They were teenagers. They had been living lives that, from the outside, contained many of the ordinary features of adolescence. And yet, beneath that surface, 2 of them had been discussing violence and murder. The court would later hear about those messages would become central to the prosecution's case because they showed that the violence had not appeared from nowhere. There had been preparation. There had been discussion. There had been a plan. And eventually, there was a location where that plan could be carried out. That location was Linear Park. The word park can create an image of safety. Green space. Open air. Walking paths. Trees. Daylight. But safety is not contained inside a word. A park is only safe when the people inside it respect the safety of others. On February 11th, that assumption failed. And yet, if someone had walked through the park shortly before the murder, they might not have noticed anything unusual. The trees would still have looked like trees. The paths would still have been paths. The winter landscape would still have carried the same muted colors. There would have been no visible sign that one of the people walking there was about to become the victim of a planned murder. That is one of the things that separates reality from fiction. In fiction, the setting often warns the audience. The camera lingers on the dark corridor. The door slowly opens. The character hesitates. The audience knows danger is coming. Real life offers no such warning. The world does not change its appearance simply because someone has died. The trees remain the trees. The road remains the road. And the person walking toward danger may have no idea that danger is there. For Brianna, the park was simply where she had arranged to meet someone. She believed she was going to see a friend. That fact would become one of the most painful elements of the case. According to the evidence later considered by the courts, Brianna thought Scarlett was her friend. That belief matters. Because friendship is more than a label. It changes behavior. It changes what we are willing to believe. If a stranger tells you to walk somewhere, you may question them. If a friend asks you to meet, the same request can feel completely normal. Trust shortens the distance between people. It lowers suspicion. It allows a person to move through the world without constantly expecting betrayal. Brianna's trust made the meeting possible. The killer's plan depended upon it. And this is where the setting of the case begins to merge with its psychology. The park provided the physical environment. The relationships provided the emotional environment. The messages provided the hidden environment. All three came together on one February afternoon. But before that happened, there was the wider community. Warrington. A town with ordinary schools, ordinary families, ordinary shops, and ordinary routines. Brianna's true crime story. She was living inside her own life. That distinction may sound obvious, but it is easy to forget when looking backward. We know how the story ends. Brianna did not. When we look at February 11th from the present, every detail feels loaded with meaning. The meeting. The park. The messages. The people involved. The journey. But Brianna experienced those moments without the benefit of hindsight. For her, the future was still open. That is one of the cruelest aspects of retrospect. We know which ordinary moments will become significant. The people living through them do not. A final goodbye rarely feels like a final goodbye. A final message rarely looks like the last message. A final journey usually feels like a journey. Only afterward does history place a mark beside it. This was the last time. This was the final message. This was the last journey. This was the last afternoon. For Brianna, that afternoon was simply February 11th. For everyone else, it would become a date they could never forget. The weather and season also matter because February in Cheshire is far removed from the bright, crowded atmosphere people might associate with a summer park. Winter strips landscapes down. Trees lose their leaves. The daylight is shorter. Colors become woodland can look dense. The environment feels quieter. But we should be careful not to turn that into something it was not. There was nothing supernatural about the landscape. Nothing about the trees caused the murder. Nothing about the weather made the crime inevitable. The setting did not create the violence. The people did. The park simply became the place where their choices converged. That distinction is essential. When a horrific event happens somewhere ordinary, people sometimes begin to attach fear to the place itself. They ask whether the location was isolated, whether it was dangerous, whether someone should have known better than to go there. But those questions can accidentally shift responsibility away from the person who chose to commit the crime. Brianna did not make herself responsible for her own death by entering a public park. She trusted someone she believed was her friend. She went to a meeting. The responsibility belongs to the people who planned and carried out the murder. The courts would eventually make that clear. Both Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe were convicted of Brianna's murder on December 20th, 2023. At the time of the killing, Jenkinson was 15 years and 8 months old. Ratcliffe was 15 years and 7 months old. Brianna was 16 years and 3 months old. The ages alone are difficult to comprehend, yet one of them would never reach adulthood. 2 others would spend the rest of their lives carrying the consequences of a murder they had committed as teenagers. That is one of the reasons this case generated such intense public attention. It challenged the familiar mental image of a murderer. There was no middle-aged criminal mastermind. No career offender with decades of violence behind him. There were 2 teenagers. And that forced an uncomfortable question into the center of the story. What happens when extreme violence comes from people who are themselves still growing up? There is no simple answer. Adolescence is a period of development. Identity is changing. Judgment is developing. Emotions can be intense. Peer relationships can become powerful. But none of those facts erase responsibility. In this case, the evidence showed something more than an impulsive act. The court heard about a sustained plan. The teenagers had discussed killing Brianna. They had arranged to meet her. Ratcliffe brought a hunting knife. And the attack followed. The fact that the weapon had been purchased before the murder became another part of the timeline. It meant the physical preparation existed alongside the psychological preparation. The plan was no longer contained inside a phone. It had entered the real world. A weapon had been acquired. A location had been selected. A meeting. That sequence is important because it reveals how far the crime had progressed before the final afternoon began. By the time Brianna arrived at Linear Park, the decision to kill her had already been made. The park was not where the plan began. It was where the plan ended. That changes the way we should look at the location. It was not the origin of the crime. It was the final stage of a process that had developed elsewhere. The true setting of the crime was larger than the park. It included school. It included friendships. It included phones. It included private conversations. It included the psychological worlds of two teenagers. And it included the social environment in which Brianna was trying to live her life. Brianna was a transgender girl. That part of her identity would become central to the public conversation after her death. But she did not enter the park as a symbol. She entered as a person. That distinction is important. After a person's death becomes nationally known, the public often begins to organize them around the issues surrounding their case. Brianna became associated with discussions about transgender safety, about hate crime, about youth violence, about online culture, about the responsibilities of schools, about the psychological development of young offenders. Those conversations matter. 16 years old, a girl with a family who loved her, a teenager with friendships and struggles and hopes, a person who deserved to come home. That is the human landscape of this case. And it is easy to lose sight of it when the investigation becomes complicated. The police would eventually have to think in terms of evidence. The lawyers would have to think in terms of legal arguments. The jury would have to think in terms of proof beyond reasonable doubt. The judge would have to think in terms of sentencing. Journalists would think in terms of facts and headlines. But Brianna's family did not experience the case as a legal problem. They experienced it as loss. For them, the most important fact was not the number of messages exchanged between the defendants. It was that Brianna was gone. A bedroom can become a strange place after a child dies. The objects remain. The clothes remain. Photographs remain. The things that once seemed ordinary become suddenly precious. A family can know every detail of an investigation and still be left with the one question that evidence cannot answer. Why did this have to happen to her? The courtroom can establish responsibility. It cannot restore a life. That is why the geography of the case extends far beyond Colchith. There is the park. There is Warrington. There are the homes. There are the digital spaces where the teenagers communicated. And then there is the world after the murder. A world in which Brianna's name would be known far beyond Cheshire. The location that once belonged to local residents became part of a national story. People who had never heard of Colchith began looking at maps. They wanted to know where Brianna had gone. They wanted to understand how two teenagers could kill another teenager in a public park. They wanted to know whether the warning signs had been visible. They wanted to know what the police had discovered. And they wanted to understand why. But no map can show motive. A map can show where someone was. It cannot show what they were thinking. A phone can show what someone wrote. It cannot always show why they believed what they wrote. A courtroom can examine evidence. It cannot completely enter another person's mind. That is why the case would eventually become as much about psychology as geography. The park tells us where the murder happened. The messages tell us something about what had been planned. The relationships tell us how Brianna was brought there. But the question of why remains more complicated. For Ratcliffe, the court found that hostility connected to Brianna's transgender identity was part of his motivation. For Jenkinson, the evidence presented a different picture, involving a fascination with murder and violence and her relationship with Brianna. They converged on the same outcome. Brianna died. That convergence is perhaps the darkest feature of the entire setting. Two different psychological paths arrived at the same physical place. Linear Park. February 11th. A 16-year-old girl. A hunting knife. And a plan. The park itself would eventually become a piece of evidence. But it could never explain the crime. It could only contain it. The explanation existed in the minds of the people who planned it. And those minds were still young. That fact makes the case difficult to categorize. It is not simply a story about hatred. It is not simply a story about jealousy. It is not simply a story about online violence. It is not simply a story about transgender identity. It is not simply a story about two troubled teenagers. It is a convergence of factors. And understanding that convergence requires us to slow down, to resist the temptation to find one dramatic explanation, to recognize that human beings can be complicated, and that terrible acts can emerge from several motivations at once. But there is one thing that should never become complicated. The responsibility for the murder lies with the people who committed it. Brianna did not cause it. Her identity did not cause it. Her friendships did not cause it. The responsibility belongs to the people who made the decisions. And that is where the setting finally brings us back to the victim. Because the physical world around Brianna was ordinary. Her life was ordinary in the way all human lives are ordinary. There were good days. There were difficult days. There were relationships. There were disappointments. There were hopes. There were moments she probably thought would matter forever and moments she probably forgot by the next morning. That is what a life looks like before it becomes a case. Messy, unfinished, full of small things. And because Brianna was only 16, her story was still being written. There were chapters she had not reached yet. The world simply never allowed her to write them. On February 11th, 2023, she entered Culcheth Linear Park. She did not know that the place would become the final setting of her life. She did not know that the two teenagers with her had already planned to kill her. She did not know that the weapon had already been acquired. She did not know that the private messages exchanged before that afternoon would later be read in a courtroom. She did not know that her name would eventually become known around the world. She knew only what she could see. A familiar person. A familiar meeting. A familiar landscape. And that is how danger sometimes looks. Not like something familiar. Something ordinary. Something you have no reason to fear. The tragedy of Brianna Gay is that the ordinary world around her did not warn her. The park did not warn her. The friendship did not warn her. The invitation did not warn her. And the people responsible did everything necessary to preserve that appearance until Brianna was where they wanted her to be. Once she arrived, the ordinary world ended. But to understand what was lost, we have to leave the park behind. Because a murder investigation can tell us how a person died. A trial can tell us who was responsible. But neither can fully answer the question of who that person was. For that, we have to return to Brianna herself. Away from the crime scene. Away from the killers. Away from the headlines. Away from the courtroom. We have to look at the 16-year-old girl who existed before February 11th became a date in British criminal history. We have to understand the person behind the photograph. The daughter behind the headline. The friend behind the case file. The girl whose family remembers laughter and life rather than the final afternoon in a park. Because before Brianna became the victim of one of Britain's most disturbing youth murder cases, she was simply living. And that is where the next chapter begins. The story of Brianna Gay cannot be understood by looking only at the place. It was a school corridor. A bus route. A bedroom. A phone held in the hand of a teenager. A friendship that had existed for only a few months. And a young girl's understanding of the people around her. These were the spaces in which the story was really taking shape. Long before Brianna entered Linear Park, she had already entered the lives of the two teenagers who would eventually be convicted of killing her. That connection began when Scarlett Jenkinson moved school in October 2022. It was not an extraordinary event. Teenagers change schools for all kinds of reasons. A new building. A new classroom. New teachers. New faces. New social groups. For the person arriving, however, a new school can feel much larger than it looks from the outside. Every corridor has unfamiliar faces. Every friendship already seems to have a history. People know one another's names. They have inside jokes. They already know who sits with whom. They know who is popular. Who is quiet. Who is difficult. Who is funny. Who is lonely. And the new student has to find a place somewhere inside that existing social structure. For Scarlett, that transition brought her into Brianna's orbit. Brianna was already there. six abilities, her own anxieties, and her own way of navigating the world. The court would later hear that Brianna could be anxious and nervous about going out. That detail becomes especially important when viewed alongside what happened later, because anxiety can make the world feel larger. A journey that seems simple to one person can feel intimidating to another. A crowded place can become exhausting. An unfamiliar situation can require preparation. And friendship can become especially valuable. When someone is anxious about going somewhere, the reassurance of a friend can make the difference between staying home and stepping outside. That is exactly what makes the betrayal in this case so difficult to understand. According to the sentencing judge, Brianna believed Scarlett was her friend. She trusted her. And Scarlett knew that Brianna needed friendship. The judge found that this trust was deliberately abused. That means the relationship between the two girls was not simply background information. It was part of the mechanism of the crime. The friendship was used to make the impossible seem ordinary. A meeting with a friend does not sound dangerous. A message from a friend does not automatically trigger fear. If a friend tells you that you can manage the journey, you may believe them. If a friend tells you where to go, you may follow. If a friend tells you not to worry, you may listen. Came the means by which she was brought into danger. That is a particularly cruel form of betrayal because it weaponizes something human beings need. Trust. We cannot live without it. Every day, people make decisions based on the assumption that others are telling the truth. We trust friends. We trust family. We trust teachers. We trust people who tell us where to go. We trust that an invitation is an invitation. We trust that a meeting is a meeting. Most of the time, that trust is justified. That is why society works. But when someone deliberately exploits it, the consequences can be devastating. For Brianna, the danger was not hidden behind a locked door. It was hidden behind a familiar face. And that is why the school environment matters. Schools are places where relationships form quickly. Teenagers see the same people repeatedly. They sit in the same classrooms. They travel together. They message each other after school. They share jokes. They share secrets. They learn each other's personalities. Sometimes those relationships become deep friendships. Sometimes they become rivalries. Sometimes they become complicated mixtures of affection, resentment, and dependence. The relationship between Brianna and Scarlett would eventually be examined through precisely that lens. Not a simple rivalry. It was a relationship in which Scarlett was drawn to Brianna. The judge later described Brianna as someone Scarlett thought was different and interesting. That attraction mattered. Because the person Scarlett ultimately helped choose as a victim was not simply a random name from a list. Brianna had become personally significant to her. And that significance appears to have existed alongside a disturbing desire to kill. This is where the setting becomes psychological. The school did not cause the murder. The friendship did not cause the murder. Brianna did not cause the murder. But these relationships created the circumstances in which Scarlett had access to her. And access is one of the most important concepts in any planned crime. A person can have a violent fantasy. A person can imagine killing someone. But imagination is separated from reality by opportunity. Who is the target? Can you reach them? Will they trust you? Can you get them somewhere? Will they come willingly? Can you control the circumstances? In this case, Brianna's trust answered several of those questions. The court later found that Scarlett knew Brianna was vulnerable and needed friendship. That is an extraordinary finding because it means the vulnerability was not merely discovered after the fact. It was understood before the murder. The person she knew enough to understand that reassurance would work. She knew enough to know that Brianna could be encouraged to leave home. And she knew enough to help guide her toward the meeting. The journey itself became part of the deception. The judge specifically noted that Scarlett encouraged Brianna not to be anxious and guided her through getting the bus. That detail gives the crime a chillingly ordinary appearance. Imagine the scene without knowing the ending. A teenager preparing to go out. A friend reassuring her. Instructions about which bus to take. Messages making sure everything is arranged. A journey through familiar roads. Nothing about that looks like murder. It looks like friendship. And that is exactly why it worked. The deception did not need to be complicated. It only needed to feel believable. The danger was hidden inside the ordinary. That is one of the central themes of this case. Nothing about the early stages necessarily looked like the kind of thing that would later be described in a murder trial. Teenagers talking. Teenagers messaging. Teenagers arranging to meet. Teenagers making plans. These are normal parts of adolescence. The difference was what was happening underneath. Scarlett and Eddie were not simply discussing where to meet. They had been discussing killing. And the more investigators later learned about those conversations, the more the court found that Scarlett had introduced the idea of killing people. At first, those ideas were described as fantasy. But over time, according to the judge's findings, the fantasy developed into a real desire to kill. By January 2023, Scarlett had shared that desire with Eddie. She had lists. She had discussed possible victims. She had moved from imagining violence to considering how it could happen. And eventually, Brianna became one of the names. This is an important distinction. A fantasy can be disturbing without becoming a crime. People can imagine terrible things without acting on them. The human mind is capable of producing thoughts that never become behavior. But when a person begins making preparations, the situation changes. When a weapon is obtained, when a target is selected, when a location is chosen, when a meeting is arranged, when another person is recruited, the distance between fantasy and reality becomes smaller. In this case, the court found that the planning became concrete. There had even been an earlier attempt to kill Brianna before February 11th. The first plan did not succeed. But instead of abandoning the idea, the plan was rearranged. A new date was chosen. February 11th. That fact changes the meaning of the final meeting completely. The murder was not the result of their opportunity. It had failed. And the people involved continued. That persistence is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. A plan that fails can be abandoned. A person can decide that enough is enough. They can walk away. They can tell someone. They can change their mind. But the plan was not abandoned. The date changed. The meeting was rearranged. And Brianna was once again brought toward the same danger. While all of this was happening, life outside the plan continued. School continued. People attended classes. Teachers taught lessons. Students talked. Parents went to work. Buses followed their routes. The world did not know what was being discussed in private. That is another uncomfortable reality of criminal investigations. The most important events can occur in secret while everything around them remains completely normal. A teenager can sit in a classroom while carrying a phone containing disturbing messages. A person can have lunch with friends while secretly planning something terrible. Someone can laugh in public and write frightening words in private. Human beings are capable of compartmentalizing. They can separate one part of their life from another. That ability can make dangerous behavior difficult to detect. From the outside, a teenager may look ordinary. They may attend school, perform well academically. They may appear socially integrated. And yet there may be thoughts or conversations that nobody around them fully understands. This was part of what made the Brianna Gay case so unsettling. The people responsible were not living in some completely separate criminal world. They were teenagers. They were part of a school community. They had families. They had friendships. They had ordinary routines. And inside that ordinary world, a murder plan developed. The court would later hear evidence about notebooks found in Scarlett's bedroom. Those notebooks, alongside the messages exchanged between the teenagers, provided insight into the thinking behind the plan. On paper, thoughts become physical. A sentence can be read. A name can be seen. A list can be counted. Something that once existed only inside a person's head becomes an object that someone else can hold. The notebooks did not create the thoughts. They preserved them. And when investigators found them, they became another window into the world that had existed before Brianna's death. The digital messages did something similar. Phones are intimate objects. For teenagers especially, a phone can contain almost an entire social world. Conversations, photographs, friendships, arguments, plans, fear, romance, anger. A person can carry hundreds of relationships in a device that fits inside one hand. That is why the messages in this case became so powerful. They were not simply pieces of communication. They were a record of the relationship between Jenkinson and Ratcliffe. The court found that the two had been good friends since they were 11. By the time they were 15, They had known each other for years. That friendship gave their conversations a certain familiarity. They could speak freely. They could discuss disturbing ideas. They could encourage one another. They could test boundaries. And eventually, one of them would ask the other to participate in murder. Eddie did not originate the plan in the same way Scarlett did. The judge found that Scarlett was the driving force behind the plan. But Eddie was not simply a passive follower. He joined the planning. He contributed. He encouraged. He knew what Scarlett wanted. He knew that the plan involved Brianna. And he chose to participate. That distinction matters because it prevents the case from becoming too simple. There was no single mastermind controlling a helpless accomplice. There were two individuals making decisions. Their motivations were different. Their personalities were different. Their roles were different. To kill Brianna. The judge also found that Eddie was capable of saying no. That is significant. Because the idea of peer pressure can sometimes make responsibility seem automatic. One teenager persuades another. The second teenager simply follows. But the evidence in this case was more complicated. Eddie had opportunities to question Scarlett. He had opportunities to refuse. And yet he participated. The two teenagers therefore entered the same physical setting with different psychological backgrounds. Scarlett had developed a deep desire to kill. Eddie had become involved in her plans. And both eventually became part of the murder. Their friendship was another layer of the setting. It existed alongside the relationship between Scarlett and Brianna. That created a triangle. Brianna knew Scarlett. Scarlett knew Eddie. Eddie knew about Brianna through Scarlett. The relationships overlapped. Information moved from one person to another. And eventually, Brianna became the target of a plan that she did not know existed. That is how the social geography of the case worked. Brianna did not walk into a random situation. She walked into a network of relationships. But she did not possess all the information inside that network. Scarlett did. Eddie did. Brianna did not. That imbalance, they knew more than she did. And the person who knew the least was the person in the greatest danger. There is something deeply unfair about that. Brianna's vulnerability was not simply physical. It was informational. She did not know what the others knew. She did not know that the meeting was part of a murder plan. She did not know that a weapon had been obtained. She did not know that an earlier plan had already failed. She did not know that another date had been selected. She did not know that the conversations on the phones were about her death. She was operating with incomplete information. They were not. That is why the journey to the park matters so much. The bus was not merely transportation. It was part of the final sequence. The reassurance was not merely kindness. It was part of the deception. The meeting was not merely social. It was the endpoint of a plan. And the park was not merely a place to spend an afternoon. It was where the plan was supposed to happen. The judge later described the murder as involving significant planning and premeditation. The planning had begun with Scarlett. Eddie joined it. And the two persisted even after the first attempt failed. That persistence is difficult to reconcile with the age of the defendants. 15 years old. At an age when most people are still learning how to manage ordinary responsibilities, they were making decisions, but age does not erase the reality of what happened. It does, however, help explain why the case would become such a profound challenge for the justice system. The court had to consider not only what they had done, but who they were at the time. They were children. But they had committed an act of extraordinary seriousness. The law therefore had to hold two realities at the same time. The seriousness of the crime, and the youth of the offenders. That tension would eventually influence their sentences. But before the courtroom, before sentencing, before the public debate, there was still the ordinary world. And in that world, Brianna's life continued. She had family. She had friends. She had school. She had the normal concerns of a teenager. She had a future. The judge later described her family as loving and supportive. Her family remembered her laughter. They remembered her as full of life. They remembered her as a good listener. Those details matter because they pull Brianna away from the crime scene. They remind us that she was not defined by the way she died. A murder investigation naturally focuses on the final day. But a human life is measured in years. Brianna had lived 16 years before that afternoon. There were thousands of ordinary days before February 11th. There were mornings, afternoons, birthdays, school days, Family moments. Private moments. Moments nobody outside her family would ever know about. Those are the moments that make up a person. The murder was only one moment. It was the final moment. It should never become the whole story. This is particularly important because Brianna's transgender identity became a major part of the public discussion following her death. That discussion was unavoidable. The court found that Eddie had displayed hostility toward Brianna because she was transgender and that this hostility formed part of his motivation. That finding would become one of the defining aspects of the case. But Brianna did not exist only as a transgender victim. She existed as a complete person. Her identity was part of her. It was not all of her. And the responsibility for the crime did not belong to her identity. It belonged to the people who chose to hurt her. That distinction matters because public narratives can simplify human beings. A person becomes a symbol. A symbol becomes a headline. A headline becomes a political argument. And somewhere inside that process, the individual can disappear. Brianna should not disappear. She should remain at the center. Not as an object of pity. Not as a statistic. Not simply as the victim of a hate crime discussion. But I had the opportunity to discover what adulthood might have looked like. And perhaps that is the most important thing about the setting. It was ordinary. The world around Brianna was not a world that looked like a murder story. It was school. Home. Buses. Friends. Phones. Green spaces. Teenage conversations. The tragedy was hidden inside those ordinary things. That is why, when we return to Linear Park, the location feels different. We know what the people inside the park knew. We know what Brianna did not. We know that the meeting was not what she believed it was. We know that the plan had existed before she arrived. We know that the people waiting for her had already crossed a psychological line. But Brianna did not know any of it. She walked into the park carrying only the information she had been given. And perhaps that is the image that should stay with us as we leave this chapter. Not the weapon. Not the crime scene. Not the courtroom. A 16-year-old girl following directions from someone she believed was her friend. A girl who was anxious about going out, reassured that she could make the journey. A girl who believed she was going to meet someone. A girl who had no reason to imagine that the people around her had already decided how the afternoon would end. The setting was ordinary, was possible. The meeting was believable. Everything looked normal. Except for the secret. And the secret was that Brianna had already been chosen. By the time she stepped into Linear Park, the decision had already been made. The world around her could not tell her. The trees could not tell her. The road could not tell her. The bus could not tell her. The people passing nearby could not see what was inside the minds of the teenagers waiting for her. Only the killers knew. And that is where the setting ends. At the edge between the world Brianna believed she was entering and the world that actually existed. One was ordinary. The other was a trap. To understand how that trap was built, we now have to step even closer to Brianna herself. Away from the map. Away from the school. Away from the park. And into the life of the girl at the center of it all. Because before the country knew the name Brianna Gay, there was simply Brianna. 16 years of life. 16 years of memories. 16 years of becoming the person her family knew and loved. And if we are going to understand what was taken from her on February 11th, we first have to understand what existed before that day. We have to meet Brianna. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to move quickly toward the crime, to rush through the childhood, arrive at the afternoon when everything changed. But Brianna's life deserves more than that. Because the setting of a murder is not only the physical location where a victim dies. It is everything that came before. The people. The relationships. The routines. The places where memories were made. The small decisions that seem meaningless until we look back and realize that they were part of the final path toward an irreversible moment. For Brianna, that world was Warrington and the surrounding area. It was a familiar landscape. A landscape in which she had grown up. A landscape that, before February 2023, had no reason to be remembered by the wider public as the place where a 16-year-old girl would be murdered. That is how places become connected to tragedy. Not because they were created for tragedy, but because something terrible happened there. Afterward, the location changes in the minds of everyone who knows the story. The same trees look different. The same paths carry a different memory. The same name appears in newspapers. A place that once meant nothing to people outside the local area becomes a location that thousands of strangers can identify. Culcheth Linear Park would become one of those places. But before it became associated with Brianna's death, it was simply part of the local landscape. That distinction matters, because it's inevitable. As though the park itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. It was not. There was nothing about the grass, the trees, or the paths that made murder inevitable. The danger came from human decisions. And those decisions had been developing somewhere else. In private conversations. In messages. In fantasies. In relationships. In the minds of two teenagers. The park was merely the final location. The real setting was invisible. That invisible setting is perhaps the most important part of the case. It was made of information. Who knew what? Who believed what? Who was being deceived? Who understood the plan? And who did not? Brianna was operating under a completely different understanding of the afternoon. She believed she was going to meet someone. The teenagers who arranged the meeting knew something she did not. That difference in knowledge created the trap. This is one of the reasons planned murders can be so difficult to prevent. The victim may not behave as though they are in danger because they genuinely do not believe they are in danger. There is no obvious threat to react to. There is no suspicious stranger to avoid. There is no warning sign that looks dramatic enough to stop everything. There is simply a plan. A meeting. A journey that everything is fine. In Brianna's case, the deception went further. The court found that Scarlett encouraged Brianna not to be anxious and helped her with the journey. It is an almost painfully ordinary detail. A friend helping another teenager get somewhere. A friend offering reassurance. A friend making sure she arrives. In another story, those actions would be acts of kindness. Here, they were part of the mechanism that delivered Brianna into the hands of her killers. That is why the word trust becomes so important. Trust is invisible. You cannot photograph it. You cannot place it in an evidence bag. You cannot measure it with a forensic test. But it affects human behavior. If we trust someone, we let them closer. We tell them things. We follow their advice. We accept their invitations. We assume they mean well. We stop asking questions. And when that trust is deliberately exploited, the victim may not realize what is happening until it is too late. That is what happened to Brianna. Her trust was not a weakness that should be blamed on her. It was a normal human response to a relationship she believed was real. The responsibility for exploiting it belongs entirely to the person who chose to betray it. That point is worth emphasizing because hindsight can be cruel. After a murder, people ask questions such as why the victim did she agree to meet? Why didn't she see the warning signs? But those questions can create an illusion of inevitability. They assume the victim possessed the knowledge that we now possess. Brianna did not. She could not see the messages investigators would later read. She could not see the evidence that prosecutors would eventually present. She did not know that her name had become part of a murder plan. She was making decisions based on the information available to her. And the information available to her had been manipulated. That is the difference between hindsight and reality. We know the ending. She did not. The same problem exists when examining the teenagers who killed her. From the outside, it is easy to look backward and treat every strange comment as a warning sign. Every unusual message. Every disturbing joke. Every change in behavior. Every disagreement. But real people do not live inside a completed timeline. Teachers do not know which conversation will later become evidence. Parents do not know which message is meaningless and which message is a warning. Friends do not know when a disturbing fantasy will remain a fantasy and when it will become an action. That uncertainty is part of the tragedy. The court later examined whether anything could reasonably have been done differently. One question concerned Scarlett's move to Brianna's school. Something? Could the school have prevented the murder? Could someone have predicted what was coming? The later coroner's investigation examined these questions. Its conclusion was that the school had acted appropriately and could not have been expected to predict the murder plot. That finding matters because it tells us something uncomfortable. Not every tragedy has a warning that can be recognized in advance. Sometimes people discover the danger only after the crime has happened. And when the danger is hidden inside private conversations between teenagers, the challenge becomes even greater. The messages were private. The plans were private. The fantasies were private. The adults around them did not have access to the full picture. Brianna certainly did not. This is one of the reasons the investigation would become so dependent on digital evidence. The phones could preserve what people tried to hide. The conversations could show what happened before the physical evidence existed. The messages could reveal the planning. And the planning would become one of the most important parts of the prosecution's case. But even the messages could not tell us everything. A text message can show words. It cannot show every emotion behind those words. It cannot perfectly reveal whether someone was joking, fantasizing, threatening, or planning. Context matters. Patterns matter. Actions matter. The words a horrifying meaning. There was a victim. There was a location. There was a weapon. There was a plan. There was a murder. The words were no longer abstract. They had become reality. That transformation is what makes the case so disturbing. The teenagers had apparently lived with violent thoughts before Brianna died. But thoughts can remain thoughts. The critical question is how they crossed the line. At some point, the idea of murder became something that could be done. At some point, Brianna became a target rather than a person. At some point, the two teenagers stopped talking about violence as fantasy and started preparing for violence as an event. The court would later examine those stages carefully. But the public story often compresses them into one sentence. They planned to kill Brianna. That sentence is accurate, but it hides the process. Planning takes time. Planning requires decisions. Planning creates opportunities to stop. At every stage, someone can choose not to continue. That is why premeditation matters. It means the crime was not simply the product of one instant. There were moments before the murder when another decision was possible. There were moments when someone could have walked away. There were moments when someone could have told an adult. There were moments when someone could have refused to participate. Did not. Instead, it continued toward February 11th. And that date would eventually become fixed in the memories of Brianna's family. A date that had once meant nothing. A Saturday. A normal day. It would become the day their daughter was killed. Dates have a strange power after death. A birthday becomes complicated. An anniversary becomes painful. A holiday can suddenly contain a memory that was never there before. And February 11th would become one of those dates. For Brianna's family, it would always mark the boundary between before and after. Before February 11th. After February 11th. Before Brianna was alive. After she was gone. That is how murder divides time. It creates a line that cannot be crossed backward. No verdict can erase it. No sentence can erase it. No explanation can erase it. The law can establish responsibility. It cannot reverse time. That is why the victim must remain at the center of the story. If the narrative focuses too heavily on the killers, the victim becomes secondary. The people responsible become the main characters. Their messages are analyzed. Their childhoods are examined. Their motives are debated. Their personalities become the subject of documentaries. Their names are remembered. But the person they killed kept in here. Brianna was not merely the reason the investigation began. She was the person whose life was taken. Everything else is secondary. The investigation exists because she died. The trial exists because she died. The evidence exists because she died. The sentences exist because she died. The public debate exists because she died. Without Brianna, there is no case. And so, before we enter the next part of the story, we have to step away from the machinery of criminal justice. We have to stop thinking about her as evidence. She was not a piece of evidence. She was a person. The phone records were evidence. The messages were evidence. The weapon was evidence. The photographs were evidence. Brianna was the victim. There is a difference. That difference can disappear in true crime storytelling if the narrator is not careful. A victim's suffering can become another plot point. A photograph can become a thumbnail. A family statement can become a dramatic ending. A death can become entertainment. But there is another way to tell the story. We can remember the human being first. We can acknowledge the horror without dwelling unnecessarily on graphic detail. We can examine the psychology without glorifying the killers. We can discuss the evidence without turning the perpetrators into celebrities. Dignity. That is especially important because she was so young. 16 years old. Still in school. still living inside the transition between childhood and adulthood. She had not finished becoming who she would become. There were versions of herself she had not yet met. There were experiences she had not yet had. Places she had not yet visited. People she had not yet met. Mistakes she had not yet made. Achievements she had not yet celebrated. She had a future. That is what was taken. Not simply one afternoon. Not simply one life in the abstract. A future. The future of a 16-year-old girl. That future could have contained almost anything. University. Work. Travel. Friendships. Love. Family. Ordinary mornings. Bad days. Good days. The things that make a human life. All of them disappeared at once. And yet, when we look at the circumstances leading to her death, the world around her remains painfully ordinary. A school. A bus. A park. A phone. A meeting. That ordinariness is perhaps more frightening than a dramatic setting could ever be, because it means the life. And that is the final lesson of the setting. The world does not always look dangerous before something terrible happens. Sometimes danger hides inside relationships. Sometimes it hides inside messages. Sometimes it hides behind reassurance. Sometimes it hides in the sentence, "I'll see you there." Brianna heard that kind of ordinary language. She had no reason to hear it as a death sentence. She went where she believed she was supposed to go. And somewhere along that journey, the ordinary world she knew began moving toward an ending.